Okay, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to our fourth presentation and our conference, online conference, the National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination. Great to see you all again. Great to have you back with us. Thank you for joining us. So we've had three presentations so far, and now we're having a fourth by Jefferson Morley, and our fifth one will be by Jeff as well. As many of you know, the mission of the Future of Freedom Foundation is to present the principal case for the libertarian philosophy. And as part of that, over the years, we have focused much of our attention on the activities of the national security establishment, this different type of governmental system that was adopted by the federal government after World War II. And part of that, of course, is to focus on the various regime change operations carried out by the national security establishment. I want to thank all of you that support the Future of Freedom Foundation. We couldn't do these programs without you, and we're very, very grateful for that. I got some news for you before we get started tonight. Since this is an online conference, we decided to do something different. Here is what it is. After Jeff gives his second presentation next week, the next speaker is going to be Douglas Horne, who, as many of you know, served on the Assassination Records Review Board on the staff. He's the author of a watershed book, especially involving the medical evidence, called Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, a 5-volume work that's available on Amazon. Now, Doug has pre-recorded his talk, and it came out to be 2 hours and 45 minutes. Okay, that's a long presentation, but I think you'll find it extremely insightful, very fascinating, very complete. Now, Zoom allows us to record up to 3 hours. And so obviously with an introduction and all that wouldn't leave a whole lot of time for Q&A. And we also couldn't see the logic of having everybody sit down from 7 to 10 on that particular Wednesday to watch this videotape. So we've come up with a variation, and which entails homework on your part, that we're going to post this video in advance. It'll be online by Monday at the latest. It could be even sooner than that. We're going to post it on our YouTube channel, also in the multimedia section of our website, fff.org. You'll also be getting an email from us with a link to it. And so we would invite you to watch this video before Horne's presentation. And then on the evening of Horne's presentation, which again is 2 weeks from tonight, he will be available for Q&A on that presentation. Keep in mind, our policy is that questions are limited to the talk, and we'll have Q&A then at that point on this presentation by Doug Horne. Now, I think I'm not sure whether I've announced before, but we also have two new speakers that we've added to the conference, which obviously extends it into May, Dr. Michael Chesser and Dr. David Mantic. These are two independent physicians that have examined the x-rays in the official autopsy records, which is a rare thing. They don't let anybody examine those x-rays without extremely high credentials. And they're going to be adding to the medical evidence that we have as this part of the conference. Then we've just added a fourth speaker on the medical evidence, which again extends the conference further into May, Dr. Gary Aguilar. And he's going to talk about the official investigations that have been carried out on the medical evidence and why they're fallacious and faulty. So we got four speakers going to be talking about the medical evidence, which is critical. Now, let me emphasize this. The medical evidence and the autopsy is critical to understanding the assassination itself. So I think you'll find the whole section of the medical evidence very fascinating and I think very persuasive. But tonight, let me give a couple of points also. You know, we've got two buttons. We did a survey and most people said they like the chat feature. So we're going to keep the chat feature. But if you want to ask a question of our speaker, which again should orient around his remarks, use the Q&A button. And then that's where the question comes into me, and then I'll address it to Jeff. So we're very, very pleased to have Jefferson Morley as one of our speakers, our speaker tonight. Jeff is a former investigative reporter for the Washington Post. He's one of my heroes in terms of research and meticulousness, and especially with respect to the Kennedy-related matters. He runs a great website called jfkfacts.org. Also, another great website, I go to both websites every day, called deepstateblog.org. He's a noted author. He's written a biography of Win Scott, who was in charge of the CIA office in Mexico during the Cold War, during the Kennedy era. He's also the author of a book called The Ghost, which is a biography of CIA counterintelligence officer James Jesus Angleton. Also the author of a book called Snowstorm in August, which deals with a race riot in the 1800s America. And then we're pleased to say that he's the author of 2 FFF books, one called CIA and JFK, the Secret Assassination Files, and then his most recent book, Morley versus CIA, My Unfinished JFK Investigation, which is what his presentation tonight and next week is going to revolve around. Without any further ado, Jeff, great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jacob. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I appreciate you taking the time. This is something that Jacob and I have worked on. The JFK story is something that Jacob and I have worked on together over the years, and Future of Freedom Foundation has always been very good to me, which I especially appreciate because I'm kind of a weak libertarian, and Jacob will tell you this. Really, I'm kind of a miserable socialist. I might be in a minority in the group here, and I'm in favor of the progressive income tax, that sort of thing. But what I like about the JFK story is it transcends all political differences. And
Jeff, let me interrupt you for a second. Would you reorient your camera upward a little bit, because it's cutting off the top of your head?
I'll back up a little bit. How about that?
That's perfect. Perfect. Okay. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks for that reminder. So the thing that I was saying, the thing that I like about the JFK assassination story is that it transcends all political differences. No matter what your political point of view, I think if you're paying attention, you understand the importance of the JFK story. And maybe you're new to the story tonight. Maybe you don't know the details of it, and you're curious, and something about the presentation here struck your interest. I think that the focus, JFK and the national security state, is very appropriate because, as we now know, the JFK story is very intertwined with multiple intelligence operations. And this isn't a matter of theory, this is a matter of documented fact. I would be remiss if I didn't take this chance to tout my books, which Jacob mentioned. If you are interested in the JFK story, both of my books, both of my CIA biographies, concern the events of 1963. Win Scott was the CIA station chief in Mexico City, so he participated in the surveillance of the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, shortly before the assassination. And James Angleton was in charge of CIA counterintelligence. He was in charge of keeping track of Oswald before the assassination because he was a defector to the Soviet Union. So my books, available on jeffersonmorleybooks.com, kind of give that background. And they're not JFK books, and they're not conspiracy books. They're books about what the JFK assassination looked like in the eyes of the CIA. I have additionally developed my JFK reporting for Future of Freedom Foundation. CIA and JFK is a collection of my reporting about the CIA and new CIA records that have come out in the last 15 or 20 years. And my new book, Morley versus CIA, which I'm going to talk about tonight, which is about a lawsuit that I launched in 2003 and went on for some 16 years seeking certain records from the Kennedy assassination. And Morley v. CIA, which is available as a Kindle ebook for all of 99 cents, tells this story in detail. So what I'm going to do tonight is I want to step back and just pause. And, we've been talking about the JFK story for a long time. I've been covering it for 25, 30 years. So it's something that never goes away. It's something that's very important. So whatever your level of interest in the story, I wanted to share a little bit about what I've learned over the years reporting on the story. And so as Jacob said, I've been a reporter in Washington for all my adult life. I worked at the Washington Post for 15 years, and I've worked at a lot of other national publications while writing my book. And I was always fascinated by the JFK story. I actually have a memory of it. I was in kindergarten when the event happened. And not that I knew who the president was, but I knew something big had happened because everybody was around the TV. So I'm of that generation that was always interested in this as a formative event of our lifetime. In writing about it, reporting about it, I was never that interested in JFK theories. I mean, there seemed to be a lot of theories, but as a reporter, I was always more interested in the facts and, what was new? What do we know now that we didn't know then? Is kind of the classic reporter's question. And so that was always my approach to the JFK story. I wasn't trying to prove a conspiracy theory or disprove a conspiracy theory. That's not really how journalism works. One of the problems that has happened with the JFK story over the years is that serious journalists haven't applied, good journalistic techniques to the story. And so conspiracy theorists, people come in, have some good ideas, sometimes good evidence, good, interesting, but they don't know how to tell a story. They don't know how to check the facts. And so we have had a very confused and crazy discourse around the assassination. I want to try and simplify a little bit and just focus tonight, before I tell you about my book, or as a way of leading up to telling you about my book, what do we know now that we didn't know then? What have we learned about the assassination in recent years? In journalism, we focus on the new. We put the news in the top paragraph of the story. That's the new facts. And we put them in the context of the old facts. And then we have a correction box down below where we correct our mistakes. And so I try and apply that method to the JFK story. What are the new facts? What are the old facts? What are the facts that are no good? So what I've wanted to do over in this time was talk about what I've learned. And so I'm going to go through, I think, 9 stories that I think anybody who wants to know about JFK's assassination should know. I should say here that I'm not going to try and talk you into my point of view. I will share what my point of view is, but these are facts, and whatever you think about the assassination, take them away and let them inform what you think about this key event in American history. So it was almost exactly a year ago, maybe a year ago tomorrow night, I think, that Bob Dylan, America's preeminent singer-songwriter, the winner of many Grammys, the winner of the Nobel Prize, put out a first new piece of recorded music in nearly 8 years. This was right when the pandemic hit, right? Think of a year ago. The pandemic had hit, and it was like, that movie where the asteroid is going to hit the Earth, like you wake up and you realize that movie is real life, and there's an asteroid coming and 500,000 people are going to die. It was a very upsetting time. It was very, and Bob Dylan takes this moment to release his first new piece of recorded music in 8 years, and it's epic. It's a 17-minute long song poem about our subject tonight, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's called Murder Most Foul, and in the song, Dylan uses the language of Shakespeare and Hollywood and popular music to kind of muse about what happened on November 22nd, 1963. How did it affect him? How did it affect the country? And it goes on and on. It's a very strange and dark piece of work, but it's very powerful in setting the scene. And what Dylan says is, November 22nd is a day that will live in infamy. And that's language that echoes Franklin Roosevelt. December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. FDR goes on the radio and says, this is a day that will live in infamy. This is an attack on the American nation. So Dylan's summoning up that when he starts talking about the assassination of President Kennedy. And then he dares to put us inside the presidential motorcade as Kennedy's going through downtown Dallas. And he says, wait a minute, boys, do you know who I am? And they say, we know who you are. And then they blew off his head while he was still in the car. And so right away, Dylan makes clear where he stands in the perennial debate about who killed the president. They blew off his head while he was still in the car. And if you listen to the rest of the song, he refers to these they about 10 other times in the song. And it's clear from the context, he doesn't name names, he's not a conspiracy theorist, thank God, that the people who killed the president, in his view, are powerful political enemies in the United States. And so, and the title of the song, Murder Most Foul, comes from Shakespeare, from Hamlet. And this is the key to kind of Dylan's thinking about the assassination. And it's important as we step back and think about this event, to think about how one of our great artists think about it. And, you know, Dylan stands back and he believes the president was killed by his enemies. That's very clear. They blew off his head while he was still in the car. And he goes on to, you know, reflect on what happened and, you know, who was responsible and how did it affect me? And as he's doing that, we really feel the assassination story coming to life. So I recommend that. I recommend that song to you. You know, it's a fitting addition to Bob Dylan's canon of protest songs, of songs about murder and justice undone. As a young man, Dylan gave us The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, true story of a Maryland woman beaten to death by a white man with a cane that was able, Dylan said, and he was acquitted. Hattie Carroll was like the George Floyd of his day. It was like people couldn't believe that it had happened. No, it was hard to comprehend, and yet it did. And respectable people were upset. Respectable white people were upset. And Dylan came along and said, "Take the rag away from your face. Now is not the time for your tears." In 1976, Dylan by then was a superstar. America was celebrating the bicentennial. Everybody's waving the flag. And Dylan drops Hurricane, the true story of Reuben Hurricane Carter, a boxer imprisoned for a triple murder he didn't commit. Everybody's waving the flag, and Dylan says it makes him feel ashamed to live in a land where justice is a game. Now, Murder Most Foul is not a song about systemic racism. It's not a song about, you know, bad white people doing things to good black people. It's actually something more radical than that. It's a song about respectable white people. It's a song about the power of impunity. And it's a song ultimately about the national security state, because that is who is hiding this secret of murder most foul. That's what he says. The title comes from Shakespeare. Hamlet, in Hamlet, Hamlet's father comes to him, his late father, the king, comes to him in a dream and says, you know, I didn't die a natural death the way everybody said. I was murdered, I was assassinated. It was a murder most foul. This is where he gets the title of his poem about Dallas on November 22nd. It was a murder most foul. And Dylan's coming to us and Hamlet's father says to him, you know, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about this? And so that's kind of, Dylan's kind of like the ghost of Hamlet's father. He kind of sounds like the ghost of Hamlet's father. And he's saying, you know, what are you going to do about this? Well, and then there's the opposing point of view, which is the respectable point of view in Washington, certainly in the world where I live, in the world of politics and policy and media. No, Mr. Dylan, I'm sorry. The president was killed by one man alone and unaided, a crazy man named Lee Harvey Oswald. It's really very simple. And this whole thing that you're getting into, there's nothing to it. And so Dylan really joins this debate. On the one side, you know, this is the official story. The Warren Commission came to this conclusion. One man alone and unaided killed the president. That's what you will hear from major news organizations. You'll hear from people like Chris Matthews, the former talk show host, knowledgeable fellow, and completely contemptuous of the idea of anybody who called into question the official story about the president's death. And so this is the debate that Bob Dylan joins. And it's a central question of American history. Who killed President Kennedy? And on the one hand, you have Bob Dylan, Nobel Prize winner, great artist, Grammy, many brilliant songs. You know, this is a murder most foul. We have to do something about this. And on the other side, these people saying, no, it's not a murder most foul. It's a murder most unfortunate. So, you know, Bob Dylan, Chris Matthews, who are you going to believe? You know, who are you going to believe? At the very most basic level, that's what we have to decide about the Kennedy assassination. What side are we, who are we with? Well, between those two, I know who I believe. You know, I'm pretty clear about that, who I think is more credible, who I would be more likely to believe. But you know what? I'm not going to talk about that because it's really not important. What some person's opinion about the JFK story, like mine, it's not important. What matters is the new facts. What do we know now? How can anybody say this? So I'm not going to talk in any conspiracy theory or anti-conspiracy theory. I'm going to tell you 9 stories, 9 things that I think anybody who's interested in the JFK story should know. And the first one is, I've just said it. Bob Dylan says, pay attention. You know, one of our great artists, you might not like him, it might not be your thing, but one of our great artists, been in public life for half a century, commenting on every aspect of our lives. And he says, JFK matters, pay attention. So I emphasize that, especially for the young people, because like, this might be a little far away. Like, how do I decide? Well, you know, Bob Dylan says, pay attention. I think that's very important. And a second point that I've learned over the years, as I've covered this story, is, you know, what did the people around the president think, right? What did they think had happened, right? I was in kindergarten, so my opinion, I'm really not, you know, well informed, but what did the people around the president think? And so in the course, I've been studying that question, and, you know, what did the people around the president? Well, let's start with the president's wife, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, who is seated next to the president when the gunfire rings out. What did she think had happened? Well, we know in 1999, a couple of historians published a book based on Soviet archives, and they had gotten access to the Russian government archives. And a week after the assassination, Jackie Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy sent a message to the Russian leadership. Okay, so the president, let's just step back. The president, popular liberal president, youngest president ever elected, goes to Dallas. He's doing well in the polls, and he's shot dead under mysterious circumstances. A man, Lee Harvey Oswald, is arrested an hour later. He's charged with the murder. He denies being responsible. And then the day after that, Oswald is shot to death while in police custody. So that's the background of this. Jackie Kennedy is sitting next to her president when the gunfire rings out as their motorcade is passing through downtown Dallas. His blood and brains are spattered all over her. She's the closest witness to the crime. Incredibly, she maintains her poise. And so a week later, she and her brother meet and they send a message to the Soviet leadership, and they give a message to a friend, a man named William Walton, who was a painter, a friend of Jackie's, who was going to Moscow for a cultural exchange trip. And they said, take this message to the Soviet leadership. And the message was this: we, meaning Bobby and Jackie Kennedy, believe that the president was killed by a major domestic conspiracy. They continued, people say that the assassin was connected to the communist world. We don't believe that. We think that there was a major domestic conspiracy. Bobby Kennedy was going to run for president again, and when he became president, he would resume his brother's policies of détente towards the Soviet Union. That was the message. So within a week of the assassination, the president's widow and the president's brother, his closest political collaborator, both believe that the president has been killed by a conspiracy. What about President Johnson? He appointed the Warren Commission, which concluded that one man alone and unaided had killed the president for no reason. He endorsed their findings publicly. Privately, Johnson never believed it. He always thought there had been a conspiracy behind the gunfire that killed the president. In February 1967, he told his aide, Walter Jenkins, he thought that there had been a CIA conspiracy to kill the president. In 1969, he told the CBS News crew that he didn't believe Oswald had acted alone. So President Johnson thought the president had been killed by his enemies. What about Fidel Castro, Kennedy's nemesis in Cuba, the communist leader of Cuba? He always said that Kennedy was killed by enemies in his own government, from the Cuban exile community and the CIA. Now you can say Fidel Castro, he's anti-American, you can't trust him. Okay, that's maybe. I mean, he survived a couple hundred CIA assassination attempts, so I think he knows what he's talking about. But what about Charles de Gaulle, very conservative president of France? He never believed Kennedy was killed by his enemies. He said, and he predicted correctly. He said, in Washington, they won't investigate. He said, they don't want to know. They don't want to find out. They won't let themselves find out. And that's what we see throughout the history of the Kennedy assassination story, is this official reluctance to investigate. And my lawsuit gets at that, and I'll get to that. But this background is important because there is this sense, you know, and you'll get it from the media that, you know, and some people ape this in conversation. No serious person could possibly believe that, you know, could doubt the official story that this one guy shot the president from the window and that's all there is to it. It's very simple. Well, no, it's not very simple, because lots of people high in government who were not crazy, not conspiracy theorists, thought the president had been killed by his enemies. Secretary of the Army at the time, Joseph Califano, who went on to become Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and a, you know, pillar of the Washington establishment. He agreed with his friend LBJ, Kennedy had been killed by conspiracy. Winston Scott, who I wrote my book about, our man in Mexico, oversaw the surveillance of Oswald. He concluded the president had been killed by a conspiracy. Fletcher Prouty was the chief of special operations at the Pentagon in 1963. He thought the president had been killed by enemies within his own government. He later became an advisor to Oliver Stone on his movie. So I mention all these stories because that's not, you know, that's not smoking gun proof of a conspiracy, but it is smoking gun proof that there's one JFK story that we know is wrong, one JFK theory. And that's the theory that no serious person doubts the official story. That theory has been definitively, empirically debunked, and we don't really need to worry about it anymore. So the next point that I say about the JFK story in 2021, some of the smartest people thought the president had been killed by his enemies. So another story that came to me, I want to show a picture here. If we could share a screen. Well, I don't seem to be able to share the screen. So
are you able just to hit, what do you see the share screen button?
Yeah, it says it's not working. It says unable, share screen didn't start.
I wish I could tell you what's wrong with that.
Okay,
there you go.
Is that going now?
Yes.
So this picture is a picture taken about an hour after the assassination. And I want to talk about it because it led me to a very interesting JFK story. It was not the story that I anticipated, but I was looking for something new. And this picture intrigued me because it was, they say picture's worth 1,000 words, right? This was 1,000 words of proof of a story that I had heard and could never confirm. So this picture is taken in the area that's known as the Grassy Knoll. This is an area overlooking where the presidential motorcade passed, where the gunfire rang out. This is where spectators were standing. And on the day of the assassination, several bystanders said that there was a young African-American couple sitting on this park bench, watching, waiting for the president to come. And I always thought this would be an interesting story because, you know, in 1963, Dallas was a Jim Crow town, you know, and here was the president who was in favor of civil rights, the first president who had come out in favor of civil rights for African Americans in a century since Ulysses Grant. So imagine their excitement at seeing the president. They were sitting here watching this, and when the gunfire rang out, they ran up and ran away. And that's what the bystanders said. One bystander said that this young couple, it was a young man about 21 and a woman of 18, were eating a lunch and drinking a soda as they waited. And when the gunfire rang out, They threw their things down and ran away. Well, if you look at this picture, it's 2 Dallas Police Department detectives. There's the bag from the local hamburger stand. They were sitting there. There's another photo where you can see the soda bottle that they had. So this young couple, and I knew the literature of the assassination. These people had never been interviewed by anyone. Okay, so they were there. So I began to look for them, like talk to JFK researchers, because these people would have been in a perfect place to decide where the gunfire came from. Some people say the gunfire came from the window of that building in the upper left-hand corner, the Texas School Book Depository. That's the official story. All the gunfire came from up there. Other people say some gunfire came from in front of the motorcade in the vicinity of this grassy knoll area, as it is called, where these young people were sitting. So I thought these were eyewitnesses to the assassination who had never been interviewed. And so I set out to find them because I thought they would be very interesting. Whatever they said would be interesting. I didn't care whether, what they said. They were witnesses to history. And so I went and looked for them. And, after a while, some people helped me. Some people tried to scam me. Some people looked at me like I was a cop. And I started to think a little better of it. And I decided, it wasn't such a great story, or it wasn't a story I could get. And so I gave up looking for them. I then, as I was reporting this story, learned that Dealey Plaza is a national historic monument. This area where the president is shot, it has been perfectly preserved for 58 years. And if you go there today, it looks exactly like the photographs in 1963. So according to the National Historic Monument rules, nothing is supposed to be changed, right? And nothing has been changed in Dealey Plaza, except for one thing. The only thing in Dealey Plaza that has been changed, that park bench where the young African-American couple saw the president of the United States shot dead, that park bench has been removed. That's the only thing that's been taken out of there. And so I thought it was a great story when I first approached it. I never found those people, but to me, it was a very revealing story nonetheless. And what it reveals is something that's very important, which is certain voices have been excluded from the assassination story from the beginning. And this young couple who has never been identified is an example of that. Now, people weren't excluded only because of their race. They were excluded because of their point of view, and they said something the government didn't agree with. And so the story of the couple on the knoll is important because it reminds us of a third development that we should really understand what we've learned in the last 20 years. And that is that some voices have been systematically excluded from the discussion of the assassination. That's what the story of the couple on the knoll tells us. Jacob talked about the medical evidence, and the medical evidence is crucial in the JFK story. I personally always shied away from it a little bit. I'm not a doctor. I'm a little bit squeamish about blood and gore and stuff like that. And I have zero expertise in medical issues. It's not something I ever reported on or knew about. So at a JFK conference in 2014, I wanted to educate myself, and I sat in for a video talk from a doctor. Dr. Robert McClellan was one of the doctors who tried to save Kennedy's life. The motorcade passes through downtown Dallas. The shots ring out in that area, whether from the building or from the grassy knoll or from someplace else. And the president is wounded badly. Texas Governor John Connally is wounded badly, and they take off to the nearest hospital. And they go in the hospital and they bring the president into trauma room 1, and they call the doctors, and all the doctors came down. Well, Dr. Robert McClellan was a 34-year-old assistant professor of surgery, and at the time, and so somebody says the president's been shot. He thinks it's a bad joke. He goes downstairs to the trauma room 1, and he sees Jackie Kennedy covered with blood, sitting outside, and he realizes, no, this is very serious. And he goes in, and all the technicians are trying to revive the president. He's still alive, he's still breathing, despite a terrible wound in his head and a wound in his back as well. And so McClellan comes in, and and in this interview that I'm watching in 2014, he describes, what that was like, and I'd never heard it in such a vivid way. And he, you can find this. You can find the interview with Dr. McClellan on Google. It's an interview with a doctor, which is what makes it good, and because it's especially technical and precise. And McClellan says, my God, he was shot from the front. And here's Dr. McClellan pointing out where the wound that he saw when he's sitting there, when he goes in to treat the president. And so as they try to save the president, Dr. McClellan is standing over the president, who's still alive, at the head of the table, and he can see the wound. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better witness. Dr. McClellan went on to a long medical career, when he died in 2019, was remembered as a great teacher and friend by people throughout the medical community, a highly, highly credible witness. And he says, my God, the president was shot from the front. Now, Dr. McClellan testified to the Warren Commission, which reached the conclusion that the president was not shot from the front. But if you read the testimony, they really try to avoid, they try and steer him away from saying what he wants to say. And so this, many years later, I was familiar with his testimony and thought it was very ambiguous. This, many years later, it's quite clear what he thought. He thought the president had been shot from the front. No doubt about it. And check out the interview on YouTube. It's very interesting. He talks about all the events that happened that day. That interview, I think, is one of the most important things that's come out in the last 20 years. And so that's another key development in the JFK story. The doctor who tried to save his life thought the shots came from the front. Okay, that's not a theory. That's what he said. Maybe it isn't true, but that is what he said. So that's a key development. And for me, who was not paying that close attention to medical evidence, that medical evidence supported my other understanding of the assassination, about the role of the CIA and many other things that have nothing to do with the actual crime scene. So that interview with Dr. McClellan is a very important one. One of the staggering things about the Kennedy assassination, and I only realized this or came to realize this in recent years, is that the president of the United States was shot dead in broad daylight and no one was ever brought to justice for the crime. I mean, that's amazing enough. But the really incredible thing, if you think about it, is no one in the US government lost their job as a result. No one at the CIA lost their job, even though they've been following the alleged assassin for 4 years. Nobody at the FBI lost their job. It was their job to keep track of a man who had lived in the Soviet Union. Nobody in the US government lost their job. Like something terrible like this happens, you'd think somebody would be responsible. Nobody was responsible. Except that, what I'm telling you, isn't quite true, because one man did lose his job. And that's the man you see here, Abraham Bolden, the first African-American Secret Service agent. After the assassination, Bolden reported to his superiors about lax procedures among Secret Service agents. He reported on a previous assassination threat against President Kennedy in Chicago 3 weeks before. And he pressed for real accountability, right? The Secret Service had the ultimate failure, right? They had failed at their job. They failed to protect the president completely. Nobody at the Secret Service lost their job because they failed to investigate the president. Abe Bolden lost his job because he wanted to investigate the death of the president. And J. Edgar Hoover framed Bolden for income tax evasion and drove him out of the Secret Service and tried to discredit him. So that, I think, and I should say, Abe Bolden is still with us. He's on Facebook, and we in the JFK community are hoping that the president will pardon Abe Bolden and expunge the frame up that he was imprisoned on, and recognize that this was a man who tried to do his job. One of the few. A lot of people said, I don't want to know, I'm not going to try and find out. Abe Bolden tried, and he paid. and he paid for it. So that comes back to my earlier point about some voices are excluded from the history of the assassination. Abe Bolden is one of those people. The most ominous development in the JFK story emerged from the unlikely venue of an estate sale in suburban Philadelphia in 2011. A man named President Kennedy's military advisor, I'm blanking on his name now, I'm sorry, Chester Clifton, had died. And his estate, his family put up some of his effects for sale. And among his effects were a tape recording of communications from Air Force One on the day of the assassination. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The efforts to revive him failed. Secret Service took control of the body and they flew back to Washington. And as they flew back to Washington, different sectors of the US government were communicating through the plane. What happened? What are we going to do? And this was a recording of the Air Force One tape on the afternoon of November 22nd. What was unusual about this tape and why JFK researchers took an interest in it was not that it was unknown. There was a version of this tape that had been made public by the LBJ library, but this tape was about 10 minutes longer. And so it had additional information about what had happened that day. And what the tape showed was that this man, General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff at the time, and a bitter critic of President Kennedy, hated President Kennedy, in fact, called President Kennedy and the people around him cockroaches. This tape revealed what Curtis LeMay did on November 22nd, and it was very interesting. He was at a hunting lodge in central Michigan. He heard the news from Dallas. He drove to a nearby air base in Canada, commandeered a US plane, and flew to Washington. While he's in the air, he's trying to decide what's going to happen. The plane is taking the president's body to Andrews Air Force Base and then to have an autopsy, either at Walter Reed Hospital or at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. So they were waiting to decide on that. LeMay sends word, no, he's not going to follow the president's plane to Andrews. He's going to go to National. And so he goes and he lands at National. That's what this new tape told us. So that was very interesting. What LeMay then did was he went to the president's autopsy. That's what this new tape proved. We never knew that before. We never knew where the generals were. We know, thanks to Oliver Stone and Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney who prosecuted a case, a conspiracy case in the 1960s, at his trial, it was revealed that the autopsy was a very tense event, controlled by military men in the dark. The scene is recreated very dramatically in Stone's JFK. And the doctors are told what they can and can't do as far as the autopsy. LeMay goes there, and in the middle of the autopsy, one of the doctors realizes that LeMay, shown here smoking a cigar, somebody's smoking a cigar in the dead president's autopsy. And that was Curtis LeMay. He came halfway across the country to attend the president's autopsy and to smoke a cigar. The doctors told him to put it out. We now know that that happened. Now, again, is that smoking gun proof of the conspiracy? No, but it is smoking gun proof that the president's enemies, like Curtis LeMay, celebrated his death. They were very happy. And that's the fifth point that anybody who's studying the JFK story should know. Kennedy's enemies celebrated his death. Now, the most significant, big picture, significant piece of new evidence in the last 20 years also relates to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that is, in 1997, the JFK Review Board discovered and made public the plans for a secret Pentagon operation in 1963 called Operation Northwoods. And Operation Northwoods was a plan approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to provoke a war with Cuba. And the way to provoke a war with Cuba was to stage a spectacular crime on US soil and blame it on Cuba. It was called an engineered provocation. This was the unanimous policy of the Joint Chiefs. It was kept completely secret for 34 years. And if you look at these plans, and there's a couple hundred pages of them, they are remarkably cynical. Hijack a plane and blame it on Cuba. Stage a terrorist attack and blame it on Cuba. Shoot up a boatload of refugees and blame it on Cuba. So that's the template of Operation Northwoods. Stage a spectacular crime and lay the blame on Cuba. Now, that is sort of what we saw on November 22nd. There was a spectacular crime and there was an immediate effort to lay the blame on Cuba. So the Operation Northwoods papers, which are available at the Mary Farrell Foundation, are essential reading and another key development in the JFK story in recent years. Is it smoking gun proof of conspiracy? No, but it is smoking gun proof that the mentality of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1963 was corrupt, anti-democratic, and conspiratorial. They had plans to fool the American people into a war that they wanted in Cuba. It was approved at the highest level. So that's a very significant development, and very significant development in mine. Which brings us to the last, I think, key development, the last two key developments in the JFK story. We're going to get to my book in a second. The next one is not one single record, but a collection of records. We now have pretty much all of the records that the CIA had or said they had on the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, before the assassination. And if you look at that whole record, now that we have it all in one place, you can see very clearly that the story that the CIA told the Warren Commission, we didn't really know much about this guy. He up and shot the president. Sorry, Mrs. Kennedy. That was a cover story. That wasn't true at all. The CIA was very well informed about Lee Harvey Oswald from the day he defected to the Soviet Union in November 1959, all the way to the time when he arrives in Dallas in 1963. So it's the totality of the Oswald file that is a major revelation of the last 15 years. Now, does it prove there was a conspiracy? No, but it does prove that the story of a lone nut is false. He was not, some guy didn't come out of nowhere to kill the president. The alleged killer of the president was very well known to a half dozen senior CIA officers right on the eve of the assassination, which raises the question, was there a CIA operation? A question people have been asking for a long time. And that brings me to the final and important JFK revelation of recent years. And that is the story of Lee Harvey Oswald and a CIA program named AMSPELL. And this is the subject of my book. Let me just give you the background about this. In the summer of 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald, a 23-year-old ex-Marine, started advocating publicly in New Orleans on behalf of a pro-Castro organization, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee was a popular group on US campuses at the time. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were kind of heroes to a lot of people. And the US government targeted the Fair Play for Cuba Committee for harassment and destruction, just like they targeted Martin Luther King. It was the same program. It was a COINTELPRO program. So Oswald gets on the radio and has a debate with some right-wing Cubans who it turns out were funded by the CIA. A right-wing group makes a tape of Oswald defending the Cuban Revolution, which will become very important. So Oswald's pro-Castro activities are publicized in the summer of 1963 by these CIA-connected organizations. One of whom was the Cuban Student Directorate, which was a favored group of the CIA, an anti-Castro group. What I discovered in my reporting was that that group with the codename AMSPELL was funded by the CIA, and not in a minor way, in a major way. This was something the CIA never shared with the Warren Commission or with any Investigative Commission. I discovered that that group, the CIA officer running that group, was a man named George Ioannidis, career CIA officer, not a super high-ranking official, but highly respected. He had never been called to testify about what his contacts, about his agent's contacts with Lee Harvey Oswald. On the night of the assassination, a few hours after the assassination, his agents go public with the story. The president was killed by a supporter of Castro, a communist. My reporting showed that that story was paid for by the CIA. So I sued the CIA. I sued the CIA for the records of this officer, George Ioannidis, who had died in 1990, never been questioned about the CIA assassination. And in the book, I tell the story of what happened as I try to extract this story from the CIA. I said at the beginning, I filed the lawsuit in 2003. The lawsuit went on for 16 years. And fortunately, the book is not that long. It won't take you 16 years to read it, more like 16 minutes. But what I learned firsthand was how the national security state treats questions about Kennedy's assassination. Here I was asking for the records of somebody who was clearly in a position to know something, maybe was involved in the manipulation of Oswald or totally missed him. Either way, he was a key player. And the CIA would give up nothing. And they fought me tooth and nail for 16 years. So in the end, in 2018, this thing was coming to a head. And my case came up before the US Court of Appeals in Washington. And so I go down to the district courthouse and I go in there and my lawyer is with me. And up there on the dais, one of the judges hearing the case is Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh knew my case. He'd heard it a couple other times in the district court. And so I'm sitting there in the federal court and I'm thinking, wow, like, I actually thought I had a shot. I'll be honest. I thought I had a shot. I thought I made it this far. This guy's listening. Maybe I can, maybe I can prevail. Maybe we can really get this. You got to read the book to find out what happened, but it did not end well. And spoiler alert, the power of the national security state and the influence that it has in the judicial system is really illuminated by my case. And it shows the difficulty that we all face in trying to really get the full story of the assassination. So that's what I think has been most important in recent years. That's the story that it led me to and where I think the story lies. I call the book my unfinished investigation. I think the story of George Ioannidis and how the CIA manipulated Oswald in the media, both before and after the assassination, is absolutely key to understanding the politics of the situation. I didn't get the whole story, but I got a lot of interesting, useful pieces of the puzzle. And we know where the rest of the story is. So, it was a disappointing experience. It took a long time, but we have made progress in coming to understand this and in completing the record. And so next week, I'm going to talk about what President Biden is going to have to do later this year about the rest of the records that haven't been made secret, and what they might tell us. But that's a whole nother story. So I'm going to stop right now and take your questions.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Excellent presentation for part one. We look forward to part two next week. We do have some questions.
Okay.
All right. In your book, this is from Charlie, CIA and JFK, you seem certain that it was indeed Oswald that visited Mexico. Well, this isn't actually on your talk, but it's enough. It's a good question. Others claim that it was a decoy imposter. Why are you certain that it was Oswald and not an imposter in Mexico City?
The variety of credible eyewitnesses, the people in the Cuban consulate, the guys in the Soviet embassy, their identification of Oswald was fairly certain. It's a fair question. There are some questions about it, but I tend to think he was there. I don't dismiss the idea that somebody, there was an imposter. I think somebody faked being Oswald on the phone at least. So I think that part of the story is true. I think the weight of the evidence suggests that he was there. I looked very carefully at that, looked at a lot of eyewitness testimony, and I think the weight of the evidence is that he was there. I do think that there was trickery around, he was manipulated while he was there too, including possibly being, having an imposter.
All right. Well, I suppose another possibility is that he was there and there was an imposter involved also.
Yeah. Exactly.
In fact, Jeff, there's been speculation that the information that the CIA is still keeping secret, where President Trump was going to release it, and then at the last minute, the CIA persuaded him not to, and extended the timeout, and that President Biden's going to have to decide again, perhaps in October 21, that information may contain a lot about the Mexico City trip. Do you have any speculation on that?
Yeah, it does. I mean, these CIA operations in Mexico were very sensitive, closely held. And, the CIA, as I showed in Our Man in Mexico, the CIA had 3 consecutive Mexican presidents on the CIA payroll. A fact that would be very embarrassing to any Mexican government. So that's the kind of thing that they're holding back. And, and along with that, sources and methods in Mexico City at that time. So it's possible that we will learn more from this next round of disclosures, if it happens, about what happened in Mexico.
Okay. Douglas says, Jeff, did you know that the young black man sitting on the bench behind the retaining wall on the knoll is seen in the Mary Muchmore film? He went over near the steps leading from Elm Street to the stockade fence and can be seen standing next to groundskeeper Emmett Hudson during the shooting. No wonder he left the area.
Right. Yes. No. That's what I'm saying is, the fact that they were there is corroborated by eyewitnesses and the Muchmore film. So, yeah, no, I'm aware of that story, and that's why it heightened my interest. They were definitely there.
Okay. Mark says, any insight on why the Washington Post was the only media to report on the Truth and Reconciliation Committee 3 years ago?
The reporters were interested. The individual reporters had an interest, and they went to their desk and said, "We want to do this." The Post had beefed up its they created a history beat called Retropolis. And so the reporters who worked on Retropolis stories, kind of had a free hand to do historical things. And, that's why they went for it. I mean, I guess, the question is that like some change of policy at the Post? No, I don't think so. I think it was just, there's a demand for copy and people want, good stories. I served as a consultant with the Post. I mean, the Post, how can I put this? When I worked at the Post, they didn't want to know. They didn't want to pursue it. It wasn't a conspiracy. Somebody wasn't covering up for the CIA. It was just the culture of the place. We're not going to go there. We're not going to pick a fight with the CIA over JFK. I mean, right or wrong, that was the attitude. So, but that's the Washington Post isn't a machine. If a reporter comes forward and says, "I got a good story," maybe it'll get in. And that's what happened in this case. And so they did a story on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they also did a good story on Lisa Pease and her book about the assassination of Robert Kennedy. So, different generation comes along, people are a little more open-minded. I hope that's the case.
And what is the Truth and Reconciliation Committee?
The Truth and Reconciliation Committee was a group that was formed around the 4 assassinations of the 1960s and calling for a reopening investigation of all of them. And there was about 60, 70, luminaries who called for the reopening of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and JFK. So,
okay.
Yeah, that was what that was about.
Okay. Now, this goes beyond your talk. If you don't want to answer, it's fine. Did the government cover up go as far as LBJ?
You know, I don't think LBJ had advanced knowledge of the assassination. I think as soon as it happened, he knew what had happened, which is why he said on Sunday morning. So President Kennedy is killed at noon, 12:30 on Friday. At 12:30 on Sunday, 48 hours later, Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover get on the phone and they agree that they want to put out the story that one man was responsible for this. And they want cut off all speculation about Oswald's possible accomplices. And so within 48 hours of the assassination, the president has not been buried yet. And the two top people in the US government, the investigation has barely begun. And the two top people in the government have already decided what the conclusion is going to be. And that's what the conclusion that the Warren Commission gave them 9 years later. So 9 months later. Did it go as far as LBJ? Well, LBJ publicly, he appointed the Warren Commission. He endorsed their findings publicly, and he never believed it privately. So did the cover-up go to LBJ? Yeah, definitely. He admitted it. He said it. He said it 3 times. He believed the president had been killed by his enemies. So yes, LBJ was part of the cover-up.
Okay. John started to ask a question about General LeMay, but it didn't come through. So John, if you want to ask your question, please do so again. Okay, Kurt says, hi, Jeff, great presentation. Along with being monitored, do you think Oswald was a mole hunter for Angleton?
No, he was not a mole hunter. Angleton's mole hunters used Oswald, okay? Now, we're getting deep into the weeds here. And so we're talking about very closely held, sophisticated CIA techniques. Here's what it looks like. So Oswald is a 20-year-old guy who goes to the Soviet Union because he, professes a belief in communism in October 1959. It's quite an audacious act for a high school dropout. He somehow figured out how to go to the only place in the world where you could quickly get a visa to go into the Soviet Union, which was Helsinki in Finland. And then he got in there. So, was Oswald a mole hunter? No, but at that time, the CIA's mole hunters were very worried about a mole in the CIA. So what they did with Oswald's file was, a defector to the Soviet Union would be somebody of interest to a mole, a Soviet spy inside the KGB, right? We're really getting into the spy versus spy stuff, but this is how the CIA works. So if you're a KGB spy inside the CIA, nobody knows who you are. A guy like Oswald defects to the Soviet Union, that's the kind of information you would want to send back to Moscow. Is this guy a spy? Is he for real? Can he help us? All of that. So what they do with with Oswald's file, this is what Angleton's people do, is they hold it very closely, okay? So the mole hunters have control of the Oswald file. All information about Oswald comes to Angleton's mole hunters. So what they do is they watch his file. Oswald's not the mole hunter. They use his file as bait for the mole. This was what was going on with Oswald. This was how one way that he was used for intelligence purposes was, could Oswald lead you to a mole inside the CIA? And at that time, James Angleton and the counterintelligence staff felt very sure that there was such a mole. So using this kind of technique, which they called the marked card, it's a known counterintelligence technique. Using this technique, they were looking for the mole. That's how Oswald is connected with Angleton's mole hunters.
Okay, another question from Kurt. Do you have any thoughts on William Burns convincing President Biden to release the JFK files?
I mean, President Biden is an institutionalist. It's frankly, it can be a strength, but in this case, it's not going to be a strength. I don't expect the CIA to release all of this material. There may be some genuine national security material, but it's pretty embarrassing. I think Burns will probably recommend, a degree of declassification, but not full disclosure. The only thing that could change his mind would be if kind of the politics of the situation change. and somehow it becomes perceived that, you know, secrecy around JFK is a negative, you know, in which case they might, you know, go with the political wind and say, let's make this stuff public. But, you know, that we're not in that situation now. So given the status quo, I think Burns will probably recommend continued withholding of this material, and probably, you know, probably pretty comprehensive. I don't think we're going to get a lot unless something changes politically.
All right. Jim says, you mentioned the CIA file on Oswald. Will we ever see a single page of the Office of Naval Intelligence file on Oswald?
You know, good question. There's a lot of records that, you know, must have existed that we've never seen, and ONI files, right? A Marine defects to the Soviet Union. There would be in what's called a 119 report. It's a standard report where they would, when somebody leaves the service, you know. So, you know, when Oswald defected, and we had testimony from a record keeper who said that there was a 119 report done after Oswald's defection, and there was another 119 done after the assassination. That was credible testimony from a military record keeper, but it was, those records were never found. They were never produced. So, you know, will we ever see those records? Probably not, you know, probably not. I mean, the JFK Review Board did a good job of getting, I believe, of getting a hold of the records that did exist in the 90s. But, you know, I think those records were probably removed or destroyed before the JFK Records Act went into effect.
Okay. Heather asks, will you be doing JFK Facts podcasts again in the near future?
Yes, I'm gonna post one tomorrow, and I'm gonna do a podcast version of my talk next week about, so what's in these files, or what might be in these files, what can we learn from them? So yes, the JFK Facts podcast will continue.
Okay, Alan asked an interesting question, and I'm wondering if you're going to cover it next week, which I think is an important part of the work you've done. Could you touch upon your interview with Jane Roman in 1994? What did she say?
Well, that's a great question. So in 1994, I did an interview with a retired CIA officer named Jane Roman, who lived here in Washington, and she was the assistant, she was the liaison officer for James Angleton, the counterintelligence chief, for many years, for 15 years. So she was his, you know, right-hand man. All communications with federal agencies from the counterintelligence staff went through Jane Roman. And I had found her name on some pre-assassination documents about Oswald. So these are documents dated before the assassination. The contents of the cable concern Oswald, and there's Jane Roman's name on it. Different CIA officers sign off on different cables. She had signed off on it. So I went to talk to her, and I showed her this document. And I went there with John Newman, military historian and JFK author who you've had. And we showed it to her, and we said, you know, tell us about this document. And it's a remarkable document. I didn't understand how important it was at the time. And I didn't really understand who she was how important she was at the time. She was a very high-ranking person. And we showed her this document, and, you know, we talked about, what does it mean? What does it tell you? And she said several things that were quite striking. One of which was that the document indicated to her that the people who signed the document, like herself, had a keen interest in Oswald before the assassination, held on a need-to-know basis. That language is the language of an operation, need-to-know basis. People who are not involved in an operation don't have a need to know. So this information about the thoroughly obscure Lee Oswald, this is 6 weeks before the assassination, is already being held on a need-to-know basis. So the interview with Jane Roman was very important in my understanding, because I understood, that's when I really began to realize that the story of the lone nut that the CIA didn't know about before the assassination was simply false. And what Jane Roman said was, she corroborated that. Oswald wasn't nobody. He was a person for whom about information was held on a, you know, there was a keen interest held on a need-to-know basis. So that interview was really a foundation for my reporting and understanding the story.
Well, my recollection in reading your your series on that, which I found absolutely fascinating, is that she acknowledged that they were falsifying information in that document or something like that.
Well, so that was another interesting thing she said was on October 10th, the document that she signed was a cable to Mexico City. The Mexico City station had picked up Oswald on their surveillance, and I believe it was Oswald visiting the Cubans and the Russians. And they pick him up on the phone, and he identifies himself as Oswald. And so they send a cable to Washington, and they say, who is Lee Oswald? And so they send back this information, and Jane Roman prepares the information. They pull Oswald's file, and they write this response back. And in the response, they say, Oswald defected to the Soviet Union. We haven't heard from him in about a year and a half. Latest headquarters information is from June 1962. This is October 1963. So it's like 17 months old. That's what the cable says. Well, we had other documents that Jane Roman had signed for about Oswald that were like 2 weeks old. And so we said, you said here, your latest headquarters information was 17 months. Over here, you've got an FBI report about Oswald that you signed 2 weeks later. And she said, yeah, she acknowledged it. She acknowledged that the information they had sent about the future alleged assassin was well, let's just say inaccurate, spectacularly inaccurate. They said they hadn't heard from him in 17 months. In fact, they had very recent information on their desk when they made that statement. So she basically acknowledged that they were lying about the man who would allegedly kill the president. And
where can people find that series on Jane Roman that you wrote?
Yeah, What Jane Roman Said can be found on the Mary Farrell site.
Okay.
And the piece is called What Jane Roman Said. And it tells the whole story of this interview.
Yep, I highly recommend it. Great series. Okay, Jay asks, regarding Oswald and the Soviet Union, are you aware of any U.S. programs designed to send Americans to that country as part of a fake defector program? And was Oswald part of such a program?
There definitely was a fake defector program. It was called Redskin. And
called what?
Redskin.
Okay.
And we don't know that Oswald was part of it. But there were, in the late 1950s, from 1955 to 1962, there were about a dozen men who went to the Soviet Union or to communist countries who defected in the language of the day. And Oswald was one of those. Some of the people who he dealt with when he was in the US Embassy in Moscow were people who had worked on the Redskin program. So, there's no proof that Oswald was part of the Redskin program, but there was a false defector program and he could have been that. And there is some very subtle evidence. It would take a long time to get into. Malcolm Blunt has developed this, that they did have advance notice of Oswald's defection. It's very difficult to prove. It's possible, but it's not proven. I'll put it that way.
And Malcolm Blunt is a researcher in the.
Malcolm Blunt is a British man, a researcher who has helped us all. And Alan Dale has written a very interesting book called "The Devil Is in the Details" about Malcolm Blunt's work. He's one of the people, one of several, who I have learned a tremendous amount from. People who just made it their business to understand how the CIA worked, and so I learned a lot from Malcolm Blunt. And the story about the fake defector program is one of the things I learned.
Okay, from Bob, do you not think that the CIA would have decades ago sanitized any records that would implicate them?
Well, yeah. On the other hand, the CIA had a chance to sanitize the records that were released in the 1990s. The government had a chance to sanitize them. And we learned a tremendous amount in those releases. So the government's ability to sanitize the record of the assassination, I wouldn't assume that it was complete. That's never been the case before. When we had massive disclosures in the 1990s, the whole history of the JFK's autopsy was rewritten, okay? by those disclosures. That wasn't, they couldn't hide that. They couldn't hide Operation Northwoods. They couldn't hide the full disclosure of the Oswald file. They drew the line at my lawsuit and at most of the records, generated by George Joannides. But I learned about Joannides through the declassifications of the 1990s. So, stuff comes out and you can piece things together. It's a mosaic effect. They're not going to hand you something, Yes, the most obvious things that implicated the government never existed or were removed a long time ago. But that doesn't mean the government has the power, a complete ability to sanitize the record. So I think that there will still be useful information in the last round of disclosures.
Okay, clarify something for me, Jeff. Are you the person who discovered the existence of Joannides, or had he surfaced before that? You are?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, from Dave. Jeff, are you familiar with Project Alpha, STFA, Special Task Force Alpha? This was a report written by Colonel Jack Hawkins for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in July '63. Hawkins had been chief of ops for the Cuba project for the BOP.
Bay of Pigs.
Bay of Pigs, okay. Do you want to comment on that?
I'm aware of it. The Task Force Alpha was basically a hit and run commando guerrilla group controlled by US military, not by Cuban exiles. They wanted to step up harassment of Cuba in 1963. Kennedy had rejected the Northwoods concept of an engineered provocation to create a war. So the Pentagon turned to this policy of stepped up sabotage, hit and run raids, and Task Force Alpha was part of that. And that continued right through the assassination. They were doing major attacks on Cuba throughout the summer and fall of 1963. Now, there is some speculation, informed speculation, that the assassination might have emanated from one of these anti-Castro guerrilla groups that, instead of turning their fire on Castro, turned it on the president. And so I'd be interested in knowing more about what Task Force Alpha did and who was on it. And if the viewer wants to send me that information, I'd like to know a little bit more about it. There's two groups called Task Force Alpha and Second Naval Guerrilla, which, these were the government's most trusted covert deadly operatives, and they were very anti-Kennedy. And they were responsive to Joint Chiefs Command, not CIA command. So, I'd like to know more. It's that kind of thing where we might learn more.
And would they send that to you at jfkfacts.org?
Yeah, editor at jfkfacts.org.
Okay. All right. David asks, what sensitive documents or artifacts do you suspect that James Angleton was eager to retrieve from Winscott's home vault upon learning of his death?
Well, you should read Our Man in Mexico for the full story there. Angleton was after, so just for people who don't know, James Angleton was chief of counterintelligence. Winscott was the CIA station chief in Mexico City, who had retired. And in 1970, he wrote a memoir in which he gave his views of his whole career. And in there, he actually refuted the Warren Commission and said the Warren Commission's account of Oswald's time in Mexico City was inaccurate. Coming from Winscott, it was a highly authoritative account since he had been in charge of the surveillance. So when Scott died suddenly of a heart attack in April 1971, Angleton flies to Mexico City to get the memoir. He knew about the memoir and they wanted to keep that public. So that was the main thing he was after. But he took all of the contents of Winscott's home office, and in there, according to various records, were boxes of tape recordings, one of which said Oswald on them, a lot of memos to CIA officials, and possibly photographs. A couple of people who worked for Scott said that he had shown them surveillance photographs of Oswald in Mexico City. Now, no such photos have ever surfaced. So, and maybe those stories weren't right, but that was the story that was told. So that's what Angleton was going for, was anything JFK related that Win Scott had in his home office. And they scooped it all up, and it all vanished into the CIA archives. We did get the memoir. Win Scott's unpublished memoir was eventually made public, and the chapter on Oswald was made public. An important event, actually, because that's a very important piece of the story, is what the CIA's man in Mexico City thought.
Well, my recollection from reading your book was that Win Scott was pushing for more investigations, and they kind of shut him down.
Well, he wasn't pushing for more investigation. He was conducting his own private investigation with his trusted deputy, Ann Goodpasture. And Ann Goodpasture, at Win Scott's behest, made it's like 100-page chronology of events related to Kennedy's assassination, and it's a key document. It's brilliantly done. It's very authoritative. And again, this is what CIA insiders were thinking about the assassination. So that's the kind of stuff that Angleton wanted to get from Win Scott.
Okay, and that book is Our Man in Mexico, which is great. I highly recommend it. All right. Douglas asks, do you know if Bob Dylan has ever been interviewed subsequent to the release of his song poem, Murder Most Foul?
No. I mean, he's a reclusive guy. He only talks to the press when he wants to. And he did not do anything on this. I sent him I sent a request for an interview. I never heard anything, which didn't surprise me. So he hasn't talked about it. People who know him have said that he's very interested in the assassination. He's been to Dealey Plaza. Some notes surfaced. I think he had given to a friend writing about the assassination. Those were sold at auction. I never saw those. But he's definitely interested in the assassination and quite knowledgeable. He's also done, he's an artist in his free time, and he's also done paintings of Ruby and Oswald.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So he's definitely into the JFK story, and the song shows it. But no, he's never been interviewed, as far as I know.
Okay, Harry asks, I'm assuming he's referring to Mexico City. If Oswald's voice was imitated on phone, isn't that a key recent proof of a conspiracy, as well as John Newman postulates?
The problem is that we don't have the tape. So you don't have definitive proof. We only have the transcript. Now, I mean, this as often happens in the JFK story, there's a story behind the story, which is there was a tape with Oswald's voice on it, and Goodpasture, Win Scott's trusted deputy, who oversaw the audio surveillance operation in Mexico City and received the transcripts of any conversation that was intercepted. She received the transcript of Oswald's conversation, and she had a tape of that conversation too, which she said she gave to Win Scott. The Warren Commission was told that the tapes had been erased because they recycled the tapes every 2 weeks. That was a very clever cover story. Ann Goodpasture told me, yes, that's true. They did recycle the tapes every 2 weeks, but she made a dub of any especially interesting conversation, and Oswald's presence was of interest to her. And so she had a tape. That tape also has never surfaced. So we don't quite have we don't have the audio proof that Oswald was imitated or somebody posed as him in Mexico City. So that's the problem of just evidence. We don't quite have the so-called smoking gun that would prove that. But the story that somebody tried to imitate Oswald on the phone, seemingly, that story is pretty strong. We just don't have the tape that would prove it.
Now, I vaguely recall, was there an account of J. Edgar Hoover calling Johnson saying, we have a recording, but the problem is it's not Oswald's voice?
Yes, no, and that's, that's sort of indirect corroboration of the imposter story. And if we had the tape, you could nail that down and say, look, yeah, that's the proof. But you have those two events, a questionable conversation in Mexico City and Hoover saying the voice on the tape is different, and then the tape disappears. So, it's a mess as evidence, but, something was going on, it seems like.
Right. Okay. James has a question on the medical evidence. I'm going to defer that for our next 4 segments after yours. Carl says, do you think there is a connection between NSAM 263, which effectively started the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, being signed on October 11, 63, and Lee Oswald applying for the job at the Texas School Book Depository on October 15, 63, just 4 days later? The close timing seems to follow the CIA's tradecraft practice of quickly moving CIA assets into place prior to an operation.
I don't think there's any connection.
You don't think there's what?
I don't think there's any connection.
Any connection? Okay.
I mean, you know, that's not how CIA operations are run. You know, I mean, a lot was happening, and so the fact that 2 significant things happened very close to each other is interesting. But, you know, I don't see any causality between that decision and Oswald's action. I don't think there was.
Okay. John asks, I'm currently conducting a detailed research project in the response of the JFK assassination. The Clifton tapes and a log book from Andrews Air Force Base do confirm that General LeMay diverted his flight to National Airport. However, the reason for this was at the time the military was on a heightened state of alert. All 4 U.S. commands were on DEFCON 3. With National being in closer proximity to the Pentagon, it's more reasonable to believe that LeMay diverted his flight so as to get to the Pentagon as expeditiously as possible to take charge of the situation. P.S. LeMay loathed Lyndon Johnson way more than he did JFK. So any comment on that?
Well, perfectly reasonable thought, except we know LeMay didn't go to the Pentagon. He went to the autopsy. He might have gone to the Pentagon after that, but by 8 o'clock, he was at the autopsy. So it's a perfectly reasonable thought that he wanted to be in command. That's definitely true. As for the claim that LeMay hated Lyndon Johnson more than JFK, I don't believe that for a minute. Curtis LeMay never referred to Lyndon Johnson and his friends as cockroaches. He did in an oral history talking about JFK. So LeMay hated JFK much more than he hated LBJ. I believe.
Okay. Mark asks, follow up if possible. I didn't see any other U.S. media cover the Truth and Reconciliation statement. So why the Post? They aren't the only media with a large group of reporters. I think you kind of answered that.
I mean, you know, there's a lot of different news organizations out there. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee was a group of civil rights, leftists, activists, you know, a good list of people, but, you know, there's lots of causes in Washington and, you know, they all don't get covered. So, you know, the other news outlets weren't interested. I don't think it's more complicated than that.
Okay, Lawrence has a question about enemies of JFK and LBJ that I think is better left to Doug Horn's second talk. Carl says, well, this is really out of the range of the talk. I'm going to leave that outside too. Brent asks, was Oswald cognizant that he was out there on the hook, a dangle, or do you think he was on some espionage assignment?
You know, that's a great question. And a guy who worked at the CIA called me up after he read my book, and he said, I really want to talk about this with you. And he had read Our Man in Mexico in the Goes. And he said, you know, based on what you're telling, and so this is not based on any personal knowledge from 1963, it's based on a knowledge of CIA tradecraft. What he told me was, he said, Oswald looks like what we call a cooperating person. And that's a slightly different category than an agent, right? An agent is somebody who you entice or recruit or coerce to do a specific task. A cooperating person, he said, is just somebody who you could count on to do something, you know, so take a package across the street, you know, might not be anything big. And he said, and when I look at the story, that's what I think Oswald was. I think he was cooperating with people who represented themselves as agents of the US government, you know, and I think that they proposed this idea of him going to, becoming a pro-Castro activist publicly. That would give him the credentials to be pro-Castro. Then he could go to the embassy in Mexico City, and maybe he could travel to Cuba. This was something the CIA was very interested in, was how did Americans get in and out of Cuba through Mexico? That's why they were watching the Mexico City embassies so closely. So that's what I think Oswald was. I don't think, it was like, go do this for us, Lee. I think it was more like, hey, Lee, help us out here. And there could be something in it for you. Some rich guys want to do something like this. That was a very common approach, was there's 3 rich men who want to, do something on Cuba. Can, think you could help? And so I think that's probably the kind of pitch he got, rather than he was in his mind of minds, I'm acting as a secret agent for the US government. I don't think so. I think it was more like an informant relationship.
Okay. Tim says, can you speak to the previous attempts that were spoken of by Bolden? I think you mentioned Chicago.
Yeah, I'm not totally conversant in them, but the story was the president was going to a football game at Soldiers Field, and there was going to be a motorcade through the city, and they canceled the motorcade. And the story that was told was, on the motorcade route, there was a sharp turn where the motorcade would slow down beneath a office building, and that there was which is eerily reminiscent of Dealey Plaza, and that there might be a gunman in that office building. So the motorcade was canceled. That was what Abe Bolden talked about. I don't know a lot more about it than that. That was, it was credible enough that they changed the motorcade, but who was the person? Did they arrest anybody? I don't know.
Okay. My vague recollection is they arrested some guy who was a Vietnam veteran and that was supposed to be the patsy, but I could be mistaken on that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Anonymous attendee asks, it is my belief that the videos and photographs taken in Dealey Plaza are the key to the Knoll shooter. Have you seen any of the complete and high quality films showing the station wagon and shooter on the Knoll? I'm not sure what.
I mean, I've seen all of the Dealey Plaza film. So, I mean, I can say that. None of them definitively depict a shooter behind the grassy, on the grassy knoll, because the area was hidden by trees and the stockade fence. There's shapes back there that could be a shooter, it could be a shadow. So I don't think that the photographic evidence is very important, especially taken in its whole. But I don't think any one photograph tells us the key to what happened in terms of where the gunfire originated.
Okay, this is an interesting question from Jim. What are the career prospects for journalists who want to investigate the JFK assassination? What would be your advice to a young journalist interested in investigating this story?
Great question. It'll be terrible for your career. I mean, in major news organizations, people simply aren't interested. Now, that could change. And if, the story broke, it might be the biggest story in 58 years. So, but, for journalists, I would recommend covering the records that are going to come out. That's a good story. Whatever they show, that says something about how the CIA treats this subject now. That's the news today, right? That's the story today. How does the CIA think about JFK's assassination today in 2021? That's news. That's something that's going on now. What happened in Dealey Plaza? That's history. Now, yes, we still live with the legacy of that. Yes, we still have this powerful national security state, and we see its ability to hide this story and hide any clarification of this story. That's the story today. The cover-up that still goes on, The debate about what happened in Dealey Plaza, that's important, but that's secondary, I think, to the question of who controls access to this story today.
All right, Mike has an actual supplemental question to that. Why do you think the media ignores most of the facts of your presentation to this day?
Another good question. I go back to de Gaulle. they don't know, they don't want to know, they don't want to find out. That's what de Gaulle, French President Charles de Gaulle predicted would be the American reaction to Kennedy's assassination. And that's exactly what happened. And so there is a culture that is still, strong in Washington that says, we're not going to question the CIA on this, on this story. It's just too destabilizing, because basically, it's a very fundamental question in American history. That's why I start with Bob Dylan. It's like, it's the most basic question. And these news organizations are locked into the official story because they don't want to challenge the agencies. And really, they don't want to say, the system failed. Law enforcement didn't figure it out. The courts didn't solve it. The press didn't get it. The CIA was able to hide key information. The Pentagon was able to hide its secret schemes. People in Washington, they don't want to admit that this, the happy story that we tell ourselves, that our government is responsive to us, that it is democratic. When there's a story like JFK that really throws all of that into doubt, they just don't want to go there. And so it's kind of a form of denial. I think that's why these news organizations, are very, very reluctant to visit any new evidence in the JFK story.
Okay, Carl says, was Angleton in a position to facilitate Oswald's being framed as the patsy? Did Angleton interact with E. Howard Hunt and or David Atlee Phillips? Two separate questions, I guess.
Yeah. Angleton was in a separate component. CIA counterintelligence staff was separate from the operations directorate where Phillips and Hunt worked. But Phillips was a counterintelligence officer. Phillips knew Angleton. He lied about that in his memoir. But we don't see any interaction between Angleton and Hunt. Angleton and Phillips, Phillips knew about Oswald before the assassination. He was clued in to those same transcripts that Ann Goodpasture received. And so Phillips knew Oswald's biography before the assassination. To the larger question, was Angleton in a position to manipulate Oswald? Absolutely. And he was in the key position because his staff controlled the Oswald file. From November 1959 to November 1963, every single piece of paper that came into the CIA concerning the obscure Oswald all wound up in one place, in one file. And that file was controlled by an office in the counterintelligence staff called the Special Investigations Group. Ann Edgeter was the chief supervisor in that office. She controlled the file personally. And she testified under oath to the House Select Committee on Assassination. And she described how the Special Investigations Group worked. She called it the office that spied on spies. These were the mole hunters. This goes back to my earlier question. These were the people who were looking for moles. These were the people who controlled the Oswald file. So yeah, Angleton had the Oswald file. They could have studied that and known a tremendous amount about it. And they were paying close attention to him throughout those 4 years. So when you look at suspects in the manipulation of Oswald, Angleton's high on the list.
Well, let me ask you a question, Jeff. Let's assume, just hypothetically speaking, that Oswald was a trained infiltrator, to be a communist infiltrator. Would Angleton necessarily have had something to do with that selection and his training and knowing that he was involved in this?
Well, I mean, Angleton was a freelancer. And so, kind of standard CIA procedures don't necessarily apply. The counterintelligence staff was really like almost a CIA within the CIA. Angleton's operations were not recorded in what was called the Central File Registry. The CIA's, their centralized intelligence. Angleton had a separate filing system. So the normal procedures for looking over operations, people checking for security, checking for, is this going to work, all of that would not have been in place for an Angleton operation. It would have only been under his own control.
Okay. Bob says, this is back to Oswald in Mexico City. He says, if there was ever a real photo of Oswald in Mexico City, don't you think it would have circulated everywhere? In other words, every newspaper would have had it by now.
Well, there were two CIA officers who worked in the Mexico City station who later testified that Win Scott showed them a surveillance photo of Oswald. The reason that it's never been in the papers is that photograph, if it existed, was never shared publicly. There was no way a newspaper could have done it. And we don't know that it did exist. We do know that two people said it existed and described it. And we do know that there was an active photographic surveillance camera on the door of the embassy that Oswald went in and out of, but we don't have a photograph. So, the photograph, if it existed, was tightly held and destroyed, maybe by, maybe it was in Win Scott's safe and Angleton got it and destroyed it. But it was never produced or shared with any investigation. So there was no way for a newspaper to ever get their hands on it.
Okay. I'm skipping a bunch of questions that I don't think really relate even indirectly to the talk. Let me see. I'm going to pass that up. Douglas makes a comment. A friend of mine in Los Angeles was a college intern with Senator Tim Wirth of Colorado during the House Select Committee's tenure. He told her, everybody in this town knows that JFK was killed by a conspiracy, but no one will officially admit it.
There was a lot of people who thought that.
John Newman said he's taking a fresh look at William Harvey as a main cog in the assassination, or a possible main cog. Have you done any research on Harvey?
I've not done any more research on Harvey. I'm working on a book now about Richard Helms. That'll be my next CIA book, who was Harvey's patron and great good friend. I have learned something in my research about him, which was, Harvey was a drunk, and by 1964 he was completely, he was a total alcoholic, and so they sort of put him out to pasture. He was a burnt out case. But in about 1967, I found a memo from Helms saying, Harvey continued to associate with organized crime figures, and Helms was notified about this, and told him that he didn't want him to do it. He was hanging out with his friend Johnny Rosselli, and Helms says to one of his aides, "I'm tired of being blackmailed by this guy." And so the idea that Dick Helms felt that Bill Harvey was blackmailing him, blackmailing him about what? Bill Harvey had a lot to hide on the JFK story, since he was the head of the CIA's assassination program. So I haven't done any original research, but Harvey was a dangerous guy. John Whitten, another senior CIA official who worked with him, said he was a thug and a gun nut. And somebody asked him, was he involved in the assassination of Kennedy? And Whitten said, well, he would have been too young to be involved in the assassination of McKinley. I thought that was a very clever, indirect way of answering the question. And this is a colleague at the highest levels of the CIA. So,
okay, Jeff, I think we're going to wrap it up on that one, and
okay.
Look forward to part 2. That was a great part 1, and look forward to next week's presentation as a continuation of what you started tonight. And thank you again for taking the time and taking all these questions. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, and so I just say to everybody in the audience, if you want to get in touch with me at Jefferson Morley on Twitter, you can DM me, and I'd be glad to, talk and take the conversation offline. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next week.